So hello and welcome to the latest edition of You Are My Boro, where I'm joined by my Northern Echo co-writer, Dom Shaw. Hiya, Dom.
Hiya, Scott. How are you doing?
I'm all right. We're on the homeward stretch. So we're going to be looking ahead today to the last game of the season, which isn't actually the last game of the season, but kind of is, but kind of isn't, against Coventry on Monday. We'll have a talk about Boro going into that game, what it means, what it doesn't mean, what it might mean for other teams in the league. And then we'll obviously have a look at the playoffs that are coming up. Boro are obviously guaranteed to finish in fourth position no matter what happens on Monday. But what we'll do is we'll kick off with a bit of a chat about things in the Boro camp and how everything's looking, because you've been down this afternoon to Rockcliffe, Dom, for Michael Carrick's pre-match press conference. So I guess the kind of salient point that's been on everyone's lips for the last, best part of a month now, really, is injuries. Who's available for Monday? Who's not available for Monday? Who's hopefully available for the playoffs? Who isn't available for the playoffs? How are we looking in terms of the injured players and where they're at going into A, the Coventry game, and then B, obviously the playoffs a week later?
Yeah, it's kind of, you go in with a bit of breath, don't you? And take a deep breath and wonder what's going to be thrown at you this week in terms of injuries. I guess the kind of headline news is the fact Johnny Howson hasn't trained all week.
Yes,
which is a worry on the back of the Rotherham game, where he obviously suffered that injury in the warm up and was forced out of there. He hasn't trained since, so you would have to say that he's unlikely to play against Coventry on Monday. We don't really know beyond that at the minute.
Yeah.
Ryan Giles is touch and go, says Carrick. So, what does that mean? It's not really clear. It wouldn't surprise me if Giles was involved on Monday, but then equally, if there's any doubt, then you don't risk him, do you?
I mean, at the very least, it sounds more positive with him in terms of the first
playoffs.
leg of that playoff semi-final, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. As for the longer term injury, I mean, some good news. McGree, McNair and Smith, who came back in on Monday, are all fine. Yeah. They came through unscathed, which is positive, obviously. But Carrick was talking about how he needs to focus on the players he's got available. And in his words, it was, I don't want to dismiss the injured players. They know I love them, but we need to focus on who's fit and available, which is probably the strongest suggestion we've had so far that certain players might not be available for the playoffs. Yeah. The other three are obviously Ramsey, Fry and Force. I asked him whether, because obviously Ramsey was pictured back at Aston Villa's training ground last week, so I asked him whether he's still there or whether he's back at Rockcliffe, and he said there's a mix of both. We're working it together. Then he talked about how it's been really unfortunate timing for Aaron, but he thinks in the long run it'll benefit him. But obviously for Boro fans at the minute, that's scant consolation, isn't it?
Yes, it's not exactly what you want to hear, and it's again, you're kind of reading between the lines and second guessing to a degree, but that is edging towards how much is he actually going to be available for the playoffs? Never mind Monday. If Carrick's saying that kind of thing. I mean, we'll just honing in on Howson. I mean, that's a worry, isn't it? Because we've spent kind of the last month talking about who Boro would most, not want to be without, which of the injured players you really need back. Well, obviously Howson wasn't really part of those conversations until he kind of broke down in the warm-up at the New York Stadium on Monday. So now all of a sudden you're looking at it and think, well, other than maybe Archer up front, because there's not really an obvious like-for-like replacement there, Howson is probably the player you'd least want to be going into the playoffs without, isn't he? Both in terms of what he gives you on the pitch in his kind of pivotal defensive midfield role, but then also just his leadership, how he galvanizes the group, what he will offer if things get a bit tricky in those playoff games. He'd be a big, big miss if he didn't make it. And now, look, we're not saying he's not going to make it, but if he's nowhere to be seen on Monday, then all of a sudden there's a doubt, isn't there?
Oh, 100%. I completely agree with you there when you say that it's what he offers is quite unique, really, isn't it? If you go through the rest of the team and the players who've been out injured, there's competition and cover everywhere. Jones coming in on the right side, Dyke-Steele and Smith, Bowler, McNair coming in for Fry, and could go on and on. Whereas what Howson offers, I know obviously Mowat can come in and do a similar job, but he's not as effective, is he? Howson's brilliant at what he does, but then, like you say, it's that experience, that knowledge, the leadership. He's won a playoffs with Norwich, obviously against Boro. So that'd be a huge miss. You've just got to hope that Howson's using all of his experience to think, look, let's not push it. Howson will know his body inside out. There's a fortnight almost between that Rotherham game and the first playoff away leg. So you would just hope that kind of there's that bit of trust, really, that Howson's why risk it for the final game, which is the point we made on Giles. And hopefully he's back for the playoffs. And I think the other thing, on a personal level for Howson, it'd be a real disappointment missing out, wouldn't it? Because how much has he talked about, for all he's established himself as a real Boro favourite, and he's been the one real success of that 2017 summer of spending. He came to win promotion, and that's what he hasn't been able to do. And although he's obviously still going to be at Boro next season, it'd kind of round things off nicely for him, wouldn't it? And I think he deserves another tilt at the Premier League as well. So I hope for player and for club, obviously for team, that he's available for the playoffs. Giles, Giles. What Giles offers is unique, isn't it? I mean, he's top.
I mean, like you say, Bolo can go in, but he doesn't do anything like the same job, does he?
No one in the league does, really.
No,
I think that's the thing. So fingers crossed. From Carrick's perspective, he talked a few weeks ago, didn't he, about how with his team selection, he almost thinks 2 and 3 games in advance. I think the frustration for him in recent weeks has been he hasn't been able to do that. He hasn't been able to plan, like in a horses for courses approach. I'll play X against Luton and Y against Rotherham or whatever. He's almost bouncing from week to week and game to game, isn't he, at the minute?
Well, other than obviously taking Akpom and Hackney out at Luton, which was obviously a kind of pre-arranged plan and something that he always wanted to do, what he hasn't even really been able to do either is necessarily rest and rotate and shuffle his pack as he would have wanted to in these 3 dead games, if you want to call them that. Because, if you look at the team on Monday, and we've had a bit of a guess at it here, that team with the absentees, assuming that there's no Giles and no Howson, pretty much picks itself. I mean, you've got Moore or Barlaser alongside Hackney. That's probably a decision to make. But obviously, Smith has to play at right back because there's no Dijksteel. McNair has to play at centre-half because there's no Fry. Bull has to play at left back because there's no Giles. Centre midfield we talk about. And then the 4 up top is really the 4 up top you've got, other than Matt Crooks. So, while we've been saying there is depth to this Boro squad, and I guess this is proof that there's depth to the Boro squad, because that's still a pretty decent starting 11, arguably the best of any team in and around the playoff conversation. What all of a sudden you don't have is anything underneath that, because I suspect the bench on Monday will be Matt Crooks plus a load of kids, plus whichever one of Barlaser and Mowat doesn't get in, plus Muniz, who'll be on there because there's nobody else to be there. And I guess that's the slight worry heading into playoffs.
Yeah, because Muniz, who you mentioned there, we had enough evidence, didn't we? Probably 3 months worth of evidence to know that if everyone was available, Muniz wouldn't be in the squad. And for all Sonny Finch and Briant Belonga, who were both involved at Rotherham, have impressed Carrick, particularly Finch. Again, we know that if everyone was available, they'd be training with the first team and they might get the chance here and there, but they wouldn't be in the squad in a full strength 8 team, would they? I agree with you. When you look at that team, I still think that team will be the strongest 11 in the playoffs, particularly that front 4. Jones, Akpom, McGree, Archer. That would terrify any defence, wouldn't it? It's beneath that, isn't it? If you're looking for a game changer, you've got Crooks, you've got Barlaser. But then, whereas previously you had potentially Jones or Force or Ramsey, depending on who you play. You've got Dijksteel to come in there, but right back's pretty solid regardless. So that's where Boro are short all at once. You look up the road at Sunderland. They haven't had a centre forward, a centre back, or the captain for the last few months. So it could be a hell of a lot worse, but it's not ideal.
No, that's it. I mean, what Boro are not having to do is put square pegs in round holes, which is really what Sunderland have had to do for the last month or so, and which is why, their run is probably all the more commendable. Now, I guess you could say we're not too many more absentees away from Boro having to do that, but obviously, hopefully, there'll be a couple coming back for the playoffs to kind of avoid that. So if we look at Monday's game then, I mean, there seems to have been a kind of wide spectrum of opinions that we've had from Boro fans who've been getting in touch with us ahead of the game, obviously off the back of the pod we did earlier in the week. Some seem to be saying this is a massive game. It's absolutely imperative Boro win it. We need to get some momentum going again. We can't go into the playoffs off the back of 3 defeats or 3 games without a win. On the other extreme, we've got, look, this game still doesn't matter. We're going to finish 4th, whatever. Yes, in an ideal world, you'd like to win it, but the more important thing is keep players fit. Don't risk anything. It's the playoff semi-finals that we need to win, not this game against Coventry. Where do you stand on that kind of spectrum?
I think it's a game Boro not need to win, obviously, because they don't need to win. But I think it's important that they do win. Or certainly that they don't lose, really, and that they put in a decent show. Because I think, firstly, you're going to have a full house there. It's the last game before the playoffs. There's a real feel-good factor around the town, isn't there? Now, going into the playoffs, a defeat at home to Coventry that doesn't move Boro from their current 4th position isn't going to dent that significantly. But I do think you want to go into it with a bit of a bounce, don't you, on a bit of a high. Carrick talks about kind of momentum coming in different ways. He says you can get momentum from performances, you can get momentum in training, but now it beats winning games, does it?
No. No.
And so I think that's important. And the other thing that Carrick talked about a lot in his press conference today was this feeling of responsibility that there are other teams not relying on Boro because, you know, it's a 46-game season and, and you end up where you end up. But that what happens at the Riverside on Monday will have an influence on how the table looks come the end of the season. So I think that Carrick does think that Boro have a professional responsibility, really, to put on a show, which shall be music to the ears of Sunderland fans, especially, but also Millwall and Blackburn and West Brom, because they Sunderland need a Boro result, don't they? Really,
they do. We'll touch on that in a second. But I mean, I agree with you, really. I think that Boro need to get a result on the board on Monday. Really, I think that, you know, like you say, you can gloss it up in lots of different ways. And yes, these are games that don't matter. Yes, it's been a much changed team. Yes, Boro actually played pretty well at Luton. But the reality will be that if Boro draw or lose on Monday, they will be going into the playoffs on their worst run under Carrick. And you can say, well, that's an irrelevance. But, you know, it will still be the narrative. It'll be what we're asking the questions about. It'll be what fans are worrying about. It'll be what rival fans are looking at it and saying, oh, you know, Boro are off their stride, aren't they? And, you know, it's a classic cliche, but the team that wins the playoffs quite often is the one that's going in with wind in their sails. And I just think Boro need to rewrite the narrative a little bit here. And like you say, the way that they will do that is by winning the game. And you know, all things aside, I think that team that we're running along the bottom there is more than strong enough to win the game. And for all that Coventry have been on a really good run, for all that Coventry need the win more than Boro do, I'd still back that Boro team to get over the line and beat them.
Yeah. And I think the other thing, and you touched on it there, when you talk about kind of teams looking at Boro and thinking, well, they've you know, taking positives from the fact Boro, if they didn't win, would be going into the playoffs 3 games without a win. Whereas if it works the other way and Boro were to kind of swap Coventry aside, as they have done other teams like Norwich and Preston at the Riverside, then suddenly there's kind of that statement performance and win a game where the other teams are kind of get their heads turned, and it's bound to have the opposite effect, isn't it? So I think that's important as well. And again, and I know we touched on, I know I said this before the Rotherham game, and that didn't exactly go to plan. I think the fact Coventry come needing something plays into Boro's hands as well, in that it's not gonna feel like an end of season dead rubber, is it? Because it's Coventry's biggest game in how many years?
Yeah, I agree with it. And let's with one little caveat, and let's have a look at things. So Boro are guaranteed to finish 4th. Whatever happens, Luton are going to finish 3rd. Boro are going to finish 4th. Now, Coventry, everything is in the balance. Coventry will make the playoffs if they avoid defeat against Boro. And that is the one scenario where if this game is level after an hour, let's say 0-0 or 1-1, I just wonder then if we're in a scenario where actually Carrick will look at it and think, okay, I've got my hour into players I want to get an hour into. Actually, now might be the time to just make a few changes, run the game down a bit, let it peter out. Coventry will clearly be thinking the one thing we need to do is not concede here. There's the one scenario where I could maybe see in the last half hour it petering out into an end of season game, because I don't really think either manager in that scenario will be desperate to win the game. Now, it might not get to that. Boro might be 3-0 up. Coventry might be 2-0 up. You know what I mean? But I think if it's level after an hour or so, you're into interesting territory then.
Just imagine the benches at Sunderland, West Brom and Blackburn on the flash scores are panicking when they see Cameron Archer's been replaced on the hour
That's
mark.
what I mean with Rodrigo Muniz with 25 minutes left. Yeah,
because all, for all Carrick talks about that responsibility, his primary concern is Boro. His primary concern.
Well, I mean,
if Archer's got an hour in his back,
after an hour, and he's just rubbing his thigh a bit, then everybody in that stadium will be saying, "Get him off."
Yeah, that's it, exactly. So, and Mark Robbins has already talked about how they'll be well aware of what's happening elsewhere. Classic final day scenes that aren't there, where there's like an update and ripples. We were saying it took me back when I was at Rotherham on Monday. It took me back to when Boro went there in the final day. The Pulis.
Yeah, I was there that day as well.
Needing a win. And did Derby go 1-0?
Was it Pulis?
Yeah. And did Derby go 1-0 down at one point?
There was about a 5-minute spell when Boro were in, wasn't there? It was very brief, but there was a little window where Boro were in the playoffs, and then within 20 minutes, everything had gone.
And the other one,
by half time, it was done and dusted, wasn't it? Not because of the Boro were letting themselves down, but everything else wasn't going.
Yeah, I'm sure John Obi Mikel scored a belt.
He did. He scored a screamer. Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
He absolutely did.
He's definitely in. Mikel's definitely in that category of. Did he really play for?
Yeah, exactly.
Positions where we got talking about it last week. I know we're going off on one here at Rockcliffe, but there was one random afternoon where Neil Warnock played Harold McCoody as a holding midfielder, and that's another one where you think, did that really happen?
There's been a few of them over the last decade.
Yeah, there's a podcast special.
There is a pod there. Did that really happen? Podcast. Yeah.
The other one I remember, just briefly on that, is when Mowbray was at Boro and Boro went to Watford needing something on the last day. Was it Cardiff? Cardiff needed to beat Palace, maybe off the top of my head, to get in, and Boro finished 7th that year, didn't they?
Yeah.
And it is, when you say that, it's, and you look at what that fight going on for the final 2 places underneath them. It's a nice position for a stress-free position.
That's it.
We're talking about these injuries and the dilemmas, but let's be honest, Boro could be in a lot more stressful position.
Yeah, you wouldn't swap it. Now, you've touched on Sunderland there, and while you were at Rockcliffe today, I was actually up at Sunderland's training ground on Thursday speaking to Mogger, Tony Mowbray, obviously, and all the same questions came up. He was basically saying he's not going to get scores from elsewhere. And to be fair to Sunderland, they need to win. So, he said, I don't want that, at least not until the last 5 minutes of the game. And then he said, you'll know because the crowd will be up or down or whatever. You'll have a sense of it. But he's like, we need to win the game. So it does me no good whatsoever to know what's going on, because ultimately, if we don't win, it's utterly meaningless what goes on there. What do you think about Sunderland? If Boro win, then Sunderland are in if they win.
If they win, at Coventry's expense, aren't they? I was just going to say what I was just going to say. I think Sunderland will win at Preston on Monday. And I know you put it to me on Monday, and we talked about what's your feeling then on how it plays out and who gets in.
Well, do you know what? All week I've thought Boro win, Millwall win, Sunderland win, which would mean Millwall and Sunderland getting into playoffs. The more the week's gone on, I still think Boro win, and I still think Millwall win. Oh. I just worry that that everybody seems to be taking it for granted that Sunderland are going to go to Preston Preston nothing to play for, and win. And I think back 12 months to when we went over there with Boro, and all right, it wasn't the same situation because it wasn't as clear cut as Boro winning the in. But it was a broadly similar situation. Preston had nothing to play for. Boro under Wilder were going there with a real outside chance, but still a chance. And what was it, 3-0 after 25 minutes? I mean, I don't think that'll happen to Sunderland, but Sunderland have been on a really good run, but they're not a side that win games easily, if that makes sense. Every time they win a game, because they don't have a real striker or a natural goal scorer, feels like a bit of a battle. It's generally in the balance in the last 5 or 10 minutes. I think that's what it'll be like for Sunderland. I think that in the last 5 or 10 minutes of that game, I'd be amazed if Sunderland were more than 1 goal up or more than 1 goal behind, if that makes sense. So I think it'll be absolutely banging the balance for them. Now, by that stage, it might not matter. But if it does, I suspect that'll be the game where things are chaotic in the last 10 minutes and everything's turning upside down.
I was surprised that Sky confirmed their picks, didn't they, for the final game? And it is Preston, Sunderland, obviously, Millwall, Blackburn, obviously, and Swansea, West Brom, or West Brom, Swansea. I forget who's at home there. And I was surprised, Swansea, West Brom, given that West Brom really, needs snookers done. I was surprised that they've picked that rather than Coventry, Boro.
Yes, well, as am I, because ultimately,
I suppose their thinking is, if Coventry go 1-0 up early on, or if Coventry, then that's that. But I don't know, Coventry's a bigger story anyway. What Mark Robins has done there.
But by the same token, if Coventry go 1-0 or 2-0 up, then it renders the entire Sunderland game irrelevant.
Yeah, that's it.
You know what I mean?
I was surprised.
I guess it doesn't if Millwall are winning. Sunderland have 2 routes in, but you get my take in it. That they're on, and I with you, I would have thought that if nothing else, just the narrative that Boro and Coventry could end up playing each other
again
the week after adds a layer of intrigue to it, doesn't it? I agree with you. Swansea West Brom to me seems like that's a real shot in the damn. I mean, for West Brom to get in, 1,000,001 things are going to have to happen, really, aren't they?
I mean, that's a meanwhile, isn't it? That's a meanwhile. West Brom won 1-0 at Swansea, but
missed out because X, Y, and Z didn't happen. Yeah, exactly.
I think when you're talking about Sunderland there, I completely agree. My thoughts are I know Boro obviously going there, Preston last year, and it turned into a right letdown, didn't it? Sunderland have got more momentum than Boro had last year. Boro had faltered, hadn't they? I mean, only a couple of months earlier we were talking about Boro potentially catching Bournemouth and going up automatically, weren't we? And obviously we know what happened. Chris Wilder and Burnley. We don't need to go over all that again. But my only fear with Sunderland is they are a very young team, aren't they? There isn't any expectation, but suddenly it's all there for them. And how are they going to cope with that? I know this isn't a Sunderland pod, so we're not going to go on too long. But but
you're right. Strangely, we've got to the 46th game of the season. It's really the first time that Sunderland have had to deal with that in 46 matches, and you're right there. You're right there. But so gun to my head, I'll still stick with it. I think that Millwall and Sunderland will get in. Coventry will miss out, and we'll be looking at a lovely Sunday lunchtime trip to the Den for Boro.
I'm saying the same. Yeah, I'm saying the same. And Duncan Watmore will be emotionally applauding the 2,000 Boro fans at the Den on a Sunday afternoon.
Meanwhile, the 2,000 Boro fans will be evading the the walk of whatever you want to call it from that station to the ground. Goodness me, I guess 12 o'clock Sunday lunchtime is a damn sight better than 7:30 on a Friday night, mind, if you're going to do that walk.
Yeah, I mean, Sunderland would be at Luton, wouldn't they, on the Saturday night, which would be an experience for them. I think that I agree with you. I think that you're looking at Boro, Millwall, Sunderland, Luton.
Yeah.
And let's see how that plays out.
Well,
and hopefully on Monday we'll get a bit more clarity on the injury front.
Yes, and obviously we'll be back next Tuesday to review the Coventry game. Obviously, all the playoffs will be set up then, so we can talk about what happened, what went right, what went wrong, but then we can also get our teeth into who Boro have actually got in the playoffs, how the games will go, and who might be available. We'll also look to get a couple of guests on in and around the playoff pods, and then hopefully we'll be able to get a special on the go maybe on location down at Wembley. That would be interesting.
That's the dream, innit?
Isn't it just, Travel lodged up on the night before the fight.
I mean, the thing with that is obviously because the dynamic we do it here, would we have to do it from our rooms next door to each other and do it?
Yeah, we would.
Or both squeeze into one screen.
One in the bathroom and one in the. Listen, we will.
Wishful thinking.
Hopefully, we've got that to talk about.
Yeah.
Well, to be fair, you can do it in Trafalgar Square. I'll go to Covent Garden. That'll work.
Yeah. It's a welcome selection dilemma, that isn't it? A welcome headache.
Isn't it just? Let's hope we're doing that. And listen, thanks again. Please please subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube. Obviously, subscribe if you're listening to it on the various podcast platforms. Comment below. Send us in any questions. We're going to make sure that we get those questions answered next week when we'll be talking all things playoffs. As I say, we'll get a couple of guests in. So great to see you. Hope you have a good weekend. Hope you enjoy Monday. And we'll see you next week for more You Are My Boro.